This is your Pastor of Prosperity, Colonel Tracy Roberts. I am so excited to be part of this conversation tonight. We're right in the middle of the last week of Jesus' life, and so we're going to be talking about some of those things here on this conversation. And I've got a couple of my friends that are brilliant scholars. Christopher Hurtado, he is a professor of mine. He's been teaching me for many years. It took us we had to get 5 diesel truck loads just to get his books when he moved down to actually, I exaggerate a little while, but when he moved down to California, he had over 200 boxes of books. This man has a library. Unless you speak multiple languages, it may not be all that great. And then I've also got my good friend David Wetzel, who has been teaching me. He taught the youth in his church professionally for many years in a seminary program, and so I'm excited to mostly listen to these gentlemen more than even speak myself, because they have got so much great information that I'm excited for. But as we're going into it, then here's what I want to start out with. Tonight is the actual Last Supper. So can we talk a little bit about the Last Supper? And I've got a few things that I want to throw in here on the Last Supper, because people oftentimes they make the assumption, there's a tradition that the Last Supper is actually the Passover Seder. And I've got a few places that I think I'm going to be able to show that that's not the case. And so, all right, David, can you introduce yourself and let the people know who you are and kind of?
Sure. So my name is David Wetzel, and I am just a student of the scriptures and of the gospel, and excited to hear what Tracy has to share with us. Particularly since it's Holy Week, I thought that by being here, it would add something to my Holy Week and would enable me to lead my family. We are still trying to decide where we want to spend Holy Week, in the dining room or in the living room.
So y'all haven't voted on that yet.
Holy Week 2020.
Yes, nice. All right, Professor Hurtado, do you have a word on the Last Supper?
He may be having some difficulty right now.
Okay.
He's muted, so we may have to come back to Professor Hurtado.
All right. Well, then one of the things that I found interesting when I was reading, and I've been studying this last week, is when he makes the bread, he breaks the bread. So he's doing the Last Supper, and he introduces the people into this idea that was first taught to us in the book of Genesis, where Abraham goes to Melchizedek, goes to the king of righteousness, and they have this drinking of the wine and breaking of the bread. And what I found really interesting to me is that the kind of bread that they use in the Greek in Mark chapter 14 and Luke 22:19 is the bread. The word that they use for it is arton, which means a loaf of bread. And if they were doing the Passover Seder, you can't have arton. You have to have, and I'm not going to, that's why I was hoping that Christopher was going to be able to help me out in this. Maybe David can, is azamon is the word for unleavened bread. That if they were doing an unleavened meal, then that's what would have shown up. And so now, just by the kind of bread that they were eating, then I know pretty definitively that they weren't doing a Passover Seder, because you can't have leavened bread during a Passover. So that was kind of a fun little blip of information that I got as I was doing some of my studies. David, in all of your years in all your years teaching seminary, I'm sure that you had an opportunity to teach these verses from time to time.
Yeah, I kind of want to know more about what meal they were having, if not a Passover. Talk to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
What he was doing the same exact ceremony that all the Jews have done on Friday night and on holy days forever. And that was the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the wine that was started by Abraham and Melchizedek. And as I'm looking at the timeline and the time frame, Jesus is the Passover Lamb. He is the Passover Lamb. And so it would be kind of hard for him to be participating in a Passover Seder and be the Passover Lamb at the same time, because once the Passover happens, Jesus is in the tomb. So in Jerusalem, when everybody is going to be celebrating and eating their Passover meals, then you've got Jesus, who is kind of being roasted in the tomb, as it were. He's in the oven being cooked as the Passover lamb. Oh my gosh! Can I just tell you something that I found really it touched my heart? Was that there's a couple of things that have touched my heart on this whole thing, but when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, when they take Yeshua's body, when they take the body of Jesus and take it to the tomb, at that moment in time, they become unclean because they have touched a dead body and they have forfeited the right to participate in the Passover Seder that year. Now, there are some traditions that allow for 1 month later for them to do it. So they're still going to get to do it, but they have to do it a month later. And I thought, how can you imagine being disqualified to participate in the Passover when you were the one that actually carried the literal Lamb of God to his resting place? If that's what disqualified me for the Passover, I'd be all for it. I would be actually excited about it. So that has been a one of those little blips. And then another little, I'm jumping around a little bit, but when Jesus said, if you'll remember, and I don't have the scriptures right in front of me, but when Jesus says to his apostles at the Last Supper, he's speaking and he says something to the effect that I will not drink the fruit of the vine until we drink it together in my Father's kingdom. Something to that effect. You might be able to quote the exact how it's said. But at that, as I've been studying and looking, when he made that statement, that is a statement that during that time that everyone would have understood that he was entering into a vow to be a Nazarite. He was entering into a Nazarite vow. When he says, so you didn't have to declare, I'm now entering into a 30-day Nazarite vow or a 2-month one. You didn't have to declare it. If you made statements like, I'm not going to drink wine right now, everybody just knew that you were taking on that special vow. And so when he did that, when he made that statement, then he was becoming a Nazarite at that very moment. And then I started connecting some other dots, which blew my mind, because I was going, one of the things that they do when they're torturing somebody, and they would have literally grabbed on the hairs of his head and the hairs of his face and just start ripping it off of him. So his beard would have been all jacked up because they would just start ripping the hair. And one of the things, so when you take on the Nazarite vow, you have to shave your head, shave everything off so that people can see that you've entered into it. And I was like going, wow, they were helping him. They didn't know what they were doing, but they were actually helping him participate in that. And so when he's going to the cross, they want to give him something that's going to kind of subdue an aesthetic. So they're giving him the hyssop and the vinegar, but basically it's mixed up so that it'll help him not feel as much pain. And 2 times he's offered. The first time he says no, he doesn't accept that at all. And then the second time he accepts it, which is now going to break his Nazarite vow. But hold on, he's okay. Because it says he took the vinegar and wine, he touched it to his lips, and as soon as he took it, that broke the Nazarite vow, and he gave up the ghost, which would have also broken the Nazarite vow, because now Jesus is going to be in the presence of the dead. And as a Nazarite, you can't be. When you take on that vow, you can't be in the presence of the dead during the period of the vow. And I was like, wow. So it was okay for him to take that little wine for his last little drink right before he died, but immediately he died after that. And those are just a couple of little blips. I guess they're maybe they're not little blips, but things that have come out in my mind.
Tracy, can I ask David a question real quick?
Absolutely, please.
So, David, I'm Joe Everyman, right? And you're an accomplished seminary teacher, from what I understand. So, how does what Tracy said, how does that speak to me, the common person that just has, maybe I just have the Old and New Testament, maybe that's all I have in my hands. How do I take that information and help that? How do I help myself during this Passover time kind of understand the significance of that from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Joseph. I think that with this information that Tracy shared, I'm listening carefully to it, and I think that we ought to do a little bit more digging, because there's always something to be learned when there's some dissonance. So there's something that doesn't agree with me, at least, when Jesus says, I'm not going to partake of the fruit of the vine, and then he does. Even if he does right before death, I think that deserves to be looked at a little more. And maybe I tossed that homework assignment to Tracy, but the other dissonance that the kernel introduces is that he's teaching us that based on the word bread, it's pretty certain that Jesus was not having a Passover feast. And he's right, because unleavened bread is always used at Passover. This matters, and I think that this might be maybe the biggest nugget that Tracy has tossed our way tonight, because it's always been a beautiful parallelism, a beautiful symbolism that Jesus was having a Passover feast, instituting the sacrament, and he was the Passover lamb all at once on that Passover night. And the Jews, of course, as well as the patristics, really love irony, symbolism, parallelism. And so they would have loved that idea, and they did love that idea of Jesus being the Passover lamb on that particular Passover. But if that's not the feast he was having, I think we do have an obligation to say, okay, let's understand the feast he was having. Tracy makes reference to the common feast or ceremony of breaking bread and taking wine that Abraham and Melchizedek did. Tracy, as we're piecing this together, tell us a little bit more about that. You know, about the traditional feast or meal of bread and wine. Can you shed any more light on what Jesus was doing in that moment if it wasn't a Passover? Because I think I think we can figure that out for the common man, as Joseph suggested.
That they were participating in their last dinner together, and one of the reasons why we know it's not the Passover meal is because it is the Passover that they're preparing to start, that next day, that they have to, that's the reason why they have to take him off the cross. They have to take him off the cross because we're coming into the Passover, and we're not coming into the weekly Sabbath. So if I'm backing up and I'm looking at what they're doing, is he is introducing the communion, the Eucharist, the sacrament. He's introducing an important thing to his people, and he's taking it from that common that has done to this very day on a Friday night all over the world. People come together and they raise their cup of wine, and then they take a loaf of bread and they break the bread, and they share the bread together. He was taking this common symbol and he was elevating it to say, you thought that it meant one thing, and now I'm going to show you that it means something better, something more important. And Yeshua, Jesus, he tells his disciples at that moment, he says, take this bread. This is representing my body. And then he says, take this wine, and with this wine, this is the blood that I'm about to shed for you and you and you and you, everybody in this room, and people that don't even have a clue what I'm doing, but I'm going to shed it for. So he raises, for me, he raises the bar, and he gives it new symbolism. And anytime you see a great teacher that's able to do that, for me, it becomes very powerful. And in my heart, I believe that Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ our Lord, was the great master teacher. Did I get you anywhere, or did I answer the question?
Well, I think it's still important that, so I guess, Joseph, getting back to the question, and so that you know my background and my approach to scriptural interpretation, I really do heavily favor an exegetical approach because I think it builds faith, and I think it gives us an accurate picture of not only who God is, but who he is in history and how he interacts with mortals. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's our obligation to resolve that dissonance. So, and can I add to it a little bit, Tracy? So I'm seeing possibilities here. One possibility that you mentioned is that if Jesus was taking a more common meal and elevating it, while at the same time the Passover was still going to be celebrated with, at the same time when he was on the cross, he being the Paschal Lamb in that way, I think the parallelism that I would want, and the whole, I don't mean to speak for a community that's not mine, but the Jewish community would want as well. I think the parallelism is still there. So I think that's a possibility. But I just pulled up Matthew 26, and I guess I'm still trying to make everything jive a little bit, because as he prepares for Holy Week, he says he prepares to keep Passover. For example,
yes,
the disciples ask him, where do you want to keep the Passover? And then he gives them those instructions, of course. Go to such a man and say to him. And the disciples do that, and they make ready the Passover. So
that's
what's happening here? Because that sounds
is important. Because it does. It sounds exactly like that he is planning for the Passover meal. And Yeshua himself even makes a statement. He says that I want to spend the Passover with you. And when he's making the statement, I believe that he knows he's not going to spend the Passover with them, because he's going to be hanging on a cross. He's going to be hanging on the cross and he is the Paschal Lamb in every sense of the word. The Paschal Lamb started being slaughtered at 3:00. He gives up the ghost at 3:00. He meets the requirements that are necessary for them. And you brought up when he sends his two disciples to go find the donkey, and that kind of backs us up a few days a little bit. But I love that section, because one of the things I started studying when I was studying on the Paschal, on the donkey, is I was like going, oh my gosh, why do they keep on saying this is a foal, which is a year old, and why they keep on focusing on that it's never been used? And then I start going into the laws and rules and regulations, and I find that if that donkey had ever been ridden or used, then when Yeshua comes into Jerusalem, his triumphal entry on Saturday, on the Sabbath, that he would have been breaking the Sabbath. But because the donkey has never been ridden, then it's okay, and no foul, because no laws have been broken. The donkey can be used and be ridden on that day. In that section, I also found a cool thing was the master tells his disciples, hey, if someone questions you, you just tell them the master needs him, and we'll bring him back in a little while. And the people went along with it. So that was kind of strong for me. But yes, in Matthew 26, there is very strong language that would lead you to believe that the Last Supper is going to be the Paschal, the Pesach is going to be part of the Passover. But when I've been putting the things on the map and putting them on day to day and hour to hour, then it doesn't fit into the timeline very well. It also would mess up the whole symbolism if he were participating in a Passover service on the same time that he was about to be the Passover Lamb. It would jack up the symbolism for that, because you can't be eating. He couldn't. For centuries, they had been practicing for the main event, and now this particular week was the main event, and they were ready to roll. And he is the main event. He is the Passover Lamb. He is everything. So he cannot participate in a Passover Seder and still be the Passover Lamb.
So can I add some clarity to this for anyone who may be listening later on? So there is a proposition from Tracy, and then there's a counterpoint from David. So the way it is read, it suggests that the Last Supper is part of the Passover. And Tracy, you're suggesting that when you take all the points and you connect all the dots, it shows that the Last Supper cannot be part of the Passover, because that would mess up some other things on the timeline. Am I hearing that correctly?
That's what I'm suggesting. Yes.
Oh, okay. I just want to make sure I'm hearing that in my mind correctly. You guys are so smart and you have all this knowledge, and I'm just Joe Everyman, and I want to make sure that I'm hearing that with clarity.
But can I say that my whole life I was taught that the Last Supper was the Passover meal. So this is not a small tradition that I'm dealing with. And but I'm now coming to the place where I'm like going, you know what? I've got traditions of my fathers, traditions that were brought to me by Rome, and those traditions, when they don't square with the facts, I'm going to go with the facts and have to set some of my traditions of my fathers on the side of the road. And sometimes it's hard. I'm not suggesting that it's easy. There have been times that it's just almost broke my heart when I'm having to go, no, but I was taught this my whole life.
Well, gentlemen, it seems like we have we've kind of taken an onion and we're starting to peel some layers back, and maybe there's going to be some people that are crying when the layers pull back a little bit. I don't
Yeah,
know,
well said.
but
Well said.
we're about 2 minutes away from being where I need to be recording wise. So I'm going to give my final thought. And then David, if you could throw a final thought about the discussion. And really, this is kind of a springboard into further discussions. The whole purpose of this video is to get people to listen and to think and maybe exercise some personal responsibility to go to the scriptures and to find what it actually says, and don't just rely on, well, so-and-so said it, I heard it so-and-so, we've always done it this way. Okay, those are all great things, but what does it say? And then where can I go to get clarity for that? And for me, I know that I can always get on my knees and I can pray to my Father in heaven, and I know he'll give me clarity. And thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this. David?
Yeah, thank you. So, as people are grappling with the thoughts that Colonel Tracy Roberts has shared, let me just, for clarity's sake, point out that he is basing his argument that the Last Supper was not a Passover feast on three things: A, the timeline; B, the word for bread that is specifically not unleavened bread; and C, that Jesus couldn't partake of the Passover and be the Passover at the same time. Those are good arguments. Tracy, so that we can do our homework and study it out further, what is the reference that uses the word bread referring to bread with leaven in it? Where's that
You're going to
reference?
be in Mark chapter 14, verse 22, Luke 22:19, and then it's also in the book of Matthew. It's probably in Matthew 26 because that's that same area. So
Pastor,
just know, yes, sir.
In all three cases, it uses the word bread with leaven in it. In
It
all
uses
three.
the Greek word arton, which means a loaf of bread, instead of, and I can't say the word for unleavened very good, azamon, which is the word. If they were using unleavened bread, then that would be the word that they would have used.
I think those are beautiful nuggets and beautiful insights, and I think you've probably done your homework, and I think you've made your conclusions. I think the rest of us who have listened now probably have some homework to do, which I think includes, as Joseph said, some prayer and some study.
And just one of the things along with that is that in those same chapters, in Luke 14 and in Luke 22, in those same chapters, they use the word unleavened bread when referring to something else. But then when it comes to later on, then they use this arton, which is a loaf of bread. So it's not a mistake or a slip of, well, I said French bread when I really meant white sliced bread. So for me, it becomes kind of obvious. Well, not obvious, because if it was obvious, everybody would see it. So the mysteries of God become not mysteries of God when they get revealed to me. And as Joseph was saying, when I go to the source, when I study it out in my mind and go to the source and don't rely on what man says, don't rely on what I say, don't rely on what your experts say, go to the source after you studied it out. And I believe God can give you the best answers that you can ever get. This has been such a blessing to have you on here, David. And I hope that we'll be able to have this kind of conversation more often.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and study with us. We are grateful.
All right,
Awesome.
Colonel, go ahead and take us out.
And this is your Pastor of Prosperity, Colonel Tracy Roberts, leaving you with the blessing of prosperity, abundance, and favor. God bless you as you bless others, and remember to live your life in purpose and on purpose always. I love y'all, and have a blessed Holy Week.